Greetings, Clarinophiles. I had an interesting conversation, at least it was interesting to me this morning, with a friend who's a clarinophile, like everyone probably who drops into this into these videos. Probably the primary content of it, at least at one point, was how to teach the clarinet tone concept to young players. Which is very, very critical. I won't go into, all the abuses and stuff, but generally speaking, a lot of teaching completely neglects the issue of actually being able to listen and hear what you're producing. It's all involved with seeing dots and slots and playing them with the correct rhythms and having the right fingers down over the right holes and so on and so forth. And so it's such an intense process that a young player can't really put any attention on how they actually sound. And yet, the characteristic clarinet sound is the very quintessential thing that they should be after almost all the time. Well, the conversation actually began, sort of flowed from what is a musical sound? Do we have any objective idea of what a musical sound is, as opposed to noise, for instance? And I came up with the opinion that the difference between musical sound and a noise is that musical sound is highly ordered and highly restricted. For instance, if you look at a sound on a screen representation of a sound, it just looks totally chaotic. There's no consistency to it. It's all over the place. There's highs and lows and highs and lows, and has no shape. It's completely amorphous, its consistency consists of being inconsistent in almost every respect. In contrast, if you say, for instance, look at a concert A that an oboist is playing, then what you see is represented is something highly ordered. First of all, we recognize the A because it's moving at 440 cycles a second, and that is the A. It's a restriction of sound to 440 cycles a second, and that gives us the pitch. So we recognize, hey, that's an A, and of course every other pitch has its own unique cycle. That's why we say that's a B or a C sharp or whatever. That sort of just covers one aspect of sound, though. The other thing, besides the consistency in the amount of the number of cycles that are being generated into the air, a musical sound, as opposed to noise, has a consistent shape, and it also has a consistent color. And you can see all these things represented on some kind of spectroscope or whatever they call those things. I have no idea what they call them, but you know what, you've seen these things, okay? So intrinsically into the sound, imagine the sound as a kind of bubble or a ball. I like to think of it as something solid, but not like concrete, and something, not like just pure water, but something in between, something that has some kind of vibrance and inside, okay? But internally, within the musical sound, you find pitch, color, and shape. These are intrinsic to a musical sound, okay? Now you say, but Tom, you're forgetting volume. No, I'm not. The thing is that we make the distinction between intrinsic elements and extrinsic elements, and the other extrinsic element, the extrinsic element that actually acts upon this sphere, this vibrant sphere that represents a musical sound, is volume. And so there's always the question when you're playing, when you're designing anything, on the stability of the pitch, color, shape envelope that the pitch, color, shape envelope has when volume acts upon it in different ways. So from pianissimo to forte to fortissimo, how stable is that shape? Does the shape begin to rupture and begin to get a little amorphous. And does the pitch change? Does the pitch sag, or does it go sharp? Does the color change? Are there more highs that all of a sudden appear in the sound? Or is there more damping with the changes of, say, less dynamic ranges playing softer? So stability in pitch, color, and shape are, very, very important. And you get those inconsistencies or those changes by acting upon pitch, color, and shape with the volume, which equates to the air as a clarinet player. So as you play forte, increase your air, what's happening to the pitch, color, shape envelope? Those are very important questions, and questions of concern not just to the designer, but also to the player in your practice. Can you play that forte? Can you do a long crescendo and diminuendo and keep, as you change the volume, which is the dynamic range, as you change the volume, how stable can your pitch, color, and shape envelope remain? That's very, very important. It's something that players need to practice, and unfortunately they neglect that probably more than anything else, because it's difficult to work on, and you really have to listen like crazy. You're just not playing long notes. You need to listen like crazy. Okay, so this conversation somehow it morphed into like, how do you present the characteristic clarinet tone to young students? And in response to that question, I described the process that I used when I had to go teach master classes and all that. When I was at LeBlanc, I traveled all around the country, and I would teach high school students, high school clarinet classes, and junior high players and all that. And so the question was, how did I help them? I only had a limited time, so what did I work on? Well, the thing I worked on is most dear to me is producing a characteristic clarinet sound. And in the next segment, I'm going to tell you what I shared with them and what the results were. So working with younger students, the process was usually pretty standard. I would come into the school, the band director wouldn't know me from Adam, and but he would accept me as, okay, here's a guy from LeBlanc, and he's going to give a presentation and try to help my clarinet section. God help him. So he would introduce me to the students, and so I would say, before we do anything, I just want you guys to spend a couple minutes warming up. And as they were warming up, what I would do is I would listen very diligently to see what kind of sounds they were making. And I heard a diversity of sounds. And so after a couple of minutes, I said, okay, well, now we're warmed up. I'd like to, first of all, ask you all a question now. How long have you guys been playing? Okay? How many have been playing 1 year? And you get maybe a couple of students. And I'd say, well, how many have been playing 2 years? Okay, 2 years. And I'd say, well, how many have been playing 3? So, probably most of the players at that time would raise their hands. So I'd say, okay, now, this is great. We've got some students been playing the clarinet for a while. We've all been making the sound, right? Because all the time you play the clarinet, whether you're tonguing or playing with your fingers or with rhythms or whatever, you're still always making the sound. So I've got a question for you, since we're all playing the clarinet here. Does anyone have any idea of what a characteristic clarinet sound is? And they would, generally speaking, look at me like a caveman would a pocket calculator. Like, does a characteristic sound? Yes, there is a characteristic sound. Of course, you hear jazz players play and all that, and the vagaries of what you run into with jazz is something quite different. But when we're talking about real classical clarinet playing, there is a certain standard. There is a certain criteria that a characteristic clarinet sound has pretty much across the board. Okay, so they would kind of wander around. No one ever would get the answer, so I'd explain to them. I said, one of the things that clarinet players, classical clarinet players, treasure as part of their characteristics, the characteristic of the sound, is the shape of the sound. We classical clarinet players call that focused. It's a focused sound. Now, what does the word focus bring to mind? Does it bring sound to mind? No. It brings photography. It brings images to mind, stuff you can see with your eyes. Well, today we're going to try to actually see a shape with our ears. And in order to do this, in order to demonstrate this, I'd like you guys to close your eyes. And I'm going to play two different sounds on my clarinet. And I want you to listen to them. And then after I finish the two sounds, just open your eyes, and I want to know which one of those sounds, if it was a photograph, which one of them would be nice and sharp and clear with good outlines and shapes, and which one would be kind of blurry and fuzzy, like you got the wrong focus setting for that photograph. So I would play two sounds, and one sound I would play with a low forward tongue position and a loose embouchure. I'd maybe play a clarion E or something like that, or a clarion F or whatever. And then the next sound, I would play the same note, but I would play it with a good tongue position, good high back tongue position, with good concentrated air. So the sound would be very, very well defined and compact. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this little test here is the lack of subjectivity of the three elements, pitch, color, and shape, of the one element that is the least controversial and the least subjective in terms of our experience is not color, and in a sense it's not pitch. The thing that's least subjective and most objective in just general experience that people have is the shape. So this was almost 100% with all the presentations I gave across the board. I would say, well, how many of you think number one was the sharpest and clearest photograph? Almost nobody would raise their hand. And I'm talking about several hundred clarinet players over a period of several years. I said, how many think that if you saw number two as a photograph, which would that be the sharpest and clearest and most in focus photograph? Everybody raised their hand. They could all hear the distinct difference between a focused and concentrated shape and something that's dispersed and diffused and also lower in pitch. I mean, there were changes in color and shape, but the most distinguished thing, I got them to concentrate on just the shape, and every one of them hear it. I said, well, look, what do you know? You've actually seen a picture, a shape, with your ears. Your ears heard the sound, and your mind clearly could understand the difference between the shape and these two sounds. Then I'd say, okay, so we've discovered that we can actually hear shapes with our ears, not just see shapes with our eyes. So now I'm going to ask you, there was something funny about that, okay? Because I produced those two sounds, right? You all agree? Yeah. Okay, and they're very different sounds. So did I need a different clarinet to produce those two different sounds? Did I have to put the first one down and pick up another clarinet to make that sound? Or did I produce both sounds on one clarinet with one mouthpiece and one reed? Yep, I just used one clarinet. So the differences that you heard must have been created behind my nose, because the clarinet and reed and all that stuff was the same. So Today we're going to work on producing a characteristic sound, that is, one that's focused and centered. And in order to do that yourself, all you have to do, you don't need my clarinet, you don't need another clarinet. What you have to do is to simply do the things that I did behind my nose, and you'll be able to reproduce a focused, concentrated clarinet sound. And so after that explanation, then I began to talk about getting the tongue position, tongue arched up and back to speed up the air, to snug the mouthpiece, bring the mouthpiece to the face, not clamping down on the reed, and I'd get them to do the lifting with the thumb, snugging, E with the tongue, get those in combination. Then I get the whole clarinet section to say we're going to produce the low sound and the up sound. And in 20 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes, the clarinet section had transformed their characteristic sound. And one of the biggest disappointments that I found in many of the presentations that I gave is that a great number of the so-called educators that were the band directors, instead of listening to what I had to say, they left the room, going out for a smoke or going to hang out in the lounge or something like that. This was their break time. Now, I have to say that I might have wanted to go out for a smoke, or though I don't smoke, but or go into the teacher's lounge, but I wouldn't do it because I wanted to hear what the guy had to say. So even if I didn't agree, with him, I wanted to hear what he had to say. So at least after he left, I would say, that guy's an idiot. Don't listen to anything he said. But I would want to know. And I'll guarantee you, I would bet almost none of these band directors had any kind of approach to teaching characteristic sound. And most of those band directors, I would say, probably all, had never even talked about producing a characteristic sound on the clarinet. And that's kind of a pity, because that's the most fundamental thing about the clarinet, is developing the tone concept and how to do it. Developing the concept, you know what to listen for. The most fundamental thing and the most objective thing is to listen for the shape. So in order to, because we live in a relative world, and the way we know whether one shape is in better focus and clearer and sharper, as opposed to one that's fuzzy and blurry and all that, is just by comparison. That's why I did the A-B comparison there with the sound. So teaching the students to listen, and then how to change what happens behind their nose in order to make the correct sound, the characteristic sound, is absolutely essential. But I find it tragically missing almost all the time, whether in private lessons or in teaching in public schools. Now, this really should be corrected because students, I hear a lot of students play, and they play a lot of notes, but it doesn't sound like a clarinet to me. And they've never been taught what a characteristic sound is and how to do it. And if they're pretty good at it, it's usually because they have a knack, they have a talent, and they're studying with someone who also had some talent, and they developed without particularly understanding exactly what they were doing. Sad. And so the way the student learned was basically by listening, by imitation. But they still didn't really know what they're doing. They just did what they had to do behind their nose in order to make it sound and approximate what the teacher was doing. Well, that's fine. That's a lot better than listening to and approximating the sound of your stand partner there in high school, which is the other option. But neither one is really an option if you're going to get real consistent development. So anyway, that's the approach that I took based on an objective understanding of what a musical sound is, as opposed to just noise, just plain old noise, okay? Musical sound is a sphere that contains pitch, color, and shape. It's made up of pitch, color, and shape. And the consideration for a player and for a designer is how stable is that sphere when volume acts upon it, playing louder and softer. These are more advanced things we're not going to go into here, but that's a basic approach to getting students to listen, to teaching them how to listen and what to listen for, and giving them some idea of what needs to be done behind their noses to help create that. And I'm going to share it. I'm sharing it with you today. I hope that it's helpful to you in your teaching and your own thinking and your own playing. And with that, I'll wish you a real nice rest of the weekend. And thanks for listening. Oh, by the way, if you don't like this, hit the dislike button twice. Hit it 4 times. Yeah, 6 times. Yeah, and if you really didn't like it, hit it 8 times. Good deal. All right. That'll teach me.